Hello and welcome to another episode of Search of the Record, a podcast coming to you from the Google Search team, discussing all things search and having some fun along the way. My name's Martin and I'm joined today by John from the Search Relations team, of which I'm also part of. Hi, John.
Hi, Martin.
And we are joined today by Zoe Clifford from the rendering team. Hi, Zoe.
Howdy.
Hey, Zoe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Zoe Clifford. You may remember me from getting up on stage with Martin at Google I/O around 2019 or so. I work for Google, bike to work on rendering. I like dogs and cats. Fun times. That's it for me.
Which one is better, dogs or cats?
Well, you're gonna make me choose between dogs and cats on a podcast, John?
Okay, fine. It depends the answer?
So I have a favorite, but I'll never admit which one. It would make the other two sad.
That's totally just like Google.
Okay, so you're in the rendering team, and I'm not sure everyone understands what rendering is about, but we have the web, you make a website, you use HTML and CSS, right? Am I missing something?
You are missing something, Martin. It's a scary word that starts with J.
GIFs.
GIFs, yes. There can also be GIFs on web pages, as well as JavaScript.
JavaScript.
No, it's not GIF. It's JavaScript. All right, okay.
It's technically GuavaScript. No, it's JavaScript.
Is GuavaScript actually useful? Do we need that for something?
Yeah, there's many web pages out there that I'm quite fond of, where if you try and load them without JavaScript, you'll just get a short string of text that says, please enable JavaScript to access this web page.
Fair. So I know that there's a lot of websites, especially when they use the wonderful term client-side rendering, that actually fetch their content using JavaScript. And I guess we want to see the content to actually be able to index it, no?
Yeah, it is generally useful to have the contents in the DOM to be able to index it.
Ooh, now we're using another fancy word, the DOM, the Document Object Model. So what's that?
What even is it? All I can tell you, Martin, is it's kind of like HTML, but unwrapped into a tree form, which reflects the browser's view of the page at runtime.
Yeah, it's like the browser's mental model of a website.
Yeah, but I've never actually read the DOM specs, so there could be something else about it that I've never heard of.
I'm not sure about that either. Now you make me question my worldview. That's something. That's interesting. Okay, so we're using the DOM, which is like the representation of all the content inside the browser. And that can be changed and controlled by JavaScript. Is that roughly accurate?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And for that, to be able to see things that have been manipulated, added, or removed by JavaScript, we have to render, right?
Right. You can also have a DOM without any JavaScript at all.
Fair, that's true. Even static websites have a DOM, yeah. But then what is this rendering? What happens inside Google search when we render a page?
Okay, so render is a very overloaded term, but in this context, it means headless browsing. Headless being a particularly gory industry term for a browser which is controlled by a computer. And the reason we run a browser in the indexing pipeline is so we can index the view of the web page as a user would see it after it has loaded and JavaScript has executed.
Okay, interesting. So I guess that involving a browser and having to kind of like run pages through a browser is pretty challenging, no?
Oh, yeah. It's very expensive. It's so expensive, the exact amount of expensiveness is highly confidential.
Then if it's so expensive, how do we decide which page should get rendered and which one doesn't?
Oh, we just render all of them, as long as they're HTML and not other content types like PDFs.
What? But that's expensive.
Yeah. It is expensive.
But then if it's so expensive, then why can... Also, is it... Okay, but we are rendering all the pages that are HTML pages. All of them get rendered, right?
Right. And it is expensive, but that expense is required to get at the contents. For the most part, pages which do not require JavaScript to index are cheap to render anyway, so we don't think about it. We just render all of them.
Ah, that's really interesting. Fantastic. And I guess we have introduced, I remember in 2019 when we were on this stage at I/O, we've introduced like the evergreen Googlebot. So we are getting browser updates pretty regularly, no?
That's correct. We follow stable Chrome, or stable Chromium, technically.
But that wasn't always the case. Why has that not been the case before 2019?
That's a good question. Because before this effort to follow stable Chrome, there was a lot of manual integration work to like take this normal browser core like Blink and turn it into a headless browser capable of running in the Google indexing pipeline. And we kind of slacked a bit on browser updates. And eventually the API we were using, the Blink Platform API, was deprecated and removed. So we had to switch to something else. And it's like, I'm tired of all these manual updates. We're just switching to Chromium.
So basically, before that, we had to install all the updates manually, and now Googlebot gets the updates fresh, more or less.
Yeah. We were very careful to make sure we had this continuous integration. I'm going to put that on my resume, by the way. Continuous integration of upstream Chromium.
Really, really fancy. That's really, really nice.
In this biz, you got to use words like continuous integration on your resume. You can't just say, I'm really good at installing updates. You got to say CI/CD.
I still have to do these things manually. I should get a John update that installs Chrome updates automatically.
You manually update your Chrome? I thought that kind of does like happen in the background automatically, no?
Well, it's like constantly constantly, like every now and then this thing that it's like, oh, you have to update your browser. And it's like, oh, God, I have to spend 15 seconds restarting my browser. So annoying.
But you get all the cool new browser features and you can build more interesting and amazing websites with it. And as far as I understand, that mostly then works with Google Search.
Mostly. So all the systems that we've taken care to extract will for sure keep working. If there's like some new attribute or something, we might not like look at it automatically, but it won't like break anything for sure.
Oh,
because we have tests to make sure that stuff doesn't break. Oh, it was a terrible time, Martin, before we had all those tests. Things would just break and no one could stop them.
I mean, I remember being a web developer back before 2019 when there was the big shift to ES6. I think that was in 2015. And we got so many new features in JavaScript and we could use none of them because Google Search wouldn't support them.
Yeah, at the time we were running an older version of Blink with an older version of V8. So we had a lot of trouble with ES6. And it was a big problem, which was one of the motivations for switching to continuous integration.
When you mention all these low-level browser parts like Blink, which is the rendering engine in Chrome, and then V8 was this JavaScript execution engine or rendering engine, then there must have been scary things that you ran into.
Yeah. Have I told you the ghost story of Iteratorect?
Iteratorect.
There was one day when we were updating our Blink version, and as part of this, we had to, do some QA, another thing to put on my resume, to make sure that the new version actually worked for all the websites out there.
So you looked at all the pages on the web?
Not all the pages. We'd divvy up a bunch of pages with the most diffs, and everyone would get 10,000 pages each to kind of glance over. It was a lot of fun. I just spent hours and hours and hours just looking at web page diffs. It was great. But one of these diffs was actually a really subtle difference. There was just something on some wiki article, not Wikipedia, one of the other wikis, about some TV series, and part of the page just looks subtly wrong to me. So I open up console.log and I see a curious error message. Iteratorect is not defined.
That is probably not defined.
That sounds like ES 6.5.
Yeah, so I thought maybe this is some kind of weird JavaScript keyword with a bizarre name. So I used a search engine to search for it, and there were 0 results.
What?
And I tried again with all the other search engines I could think of, and there were still 0 results.
So then you made a page, and now you rank.
I searched in the page, and the page didn't reference it anywhere. And I searched in the browser source code, and it wasn't referenced anywhere there either.
Whoa.
It was a ghost in the machine.
A ghost in the shell. Where did it come from in the end?
It came from V8.
V8. Okay.
Yeah. So the code has changed since then, but at the time, V8 came with some bundled JavaScript files, which is part of compiling the browser. These JavaScript files would get pre-processed and shoved into C arrays. C arrays being kind of the C++ equivalent of data URLs. But as part of this pre-processing, there was a macro substitution step where it would substitute one string for another string. And this macro substitution tried to substitute 2 strings at once, only there was some overlap. So if they were substituted in the wrong order, this was indeterministic order because of Python dictionary ordering, then it would produce this bad output of iterator-ect from iterator and object.
Oh.
I couldn't tell you the exact details now, but it was something like that. If you search for my name in the Chrome commit log, and it's quite hard to find now, but it's somewhere in there.
Oh, wow. So your browser was hallucinating before hallucinating was cool.
Yeah. So that was some gnarly stuff there. And that was my first contribution to the Chromium code base.
Cool. So one of the questions I sometimes hear from people is whether it makes sense to implement structured data using JavaScript. And the worry is sometimes is like, it's too fragile, or like Google hates JavaScript. It's like, of course, they don't tell Martin that, but they tell me that sometimes. What do you think? Is implementing structured data with JavaScript, is that a problem? Does that work well? How do you see that?
We're very good at executing JavaScript, and I think JavaScript's great. We mentioned a lot of problems with like ES6, but now that we're following like normal Chromium release schedule, we basically get new JavaScript keywords for free, and for the most part, don't throw weird exceptions that won't also be thrown in the web. That said, it is possible for stuff to go wrong in particularly complicated scenarios. For example, if a web page is loading hundreds and hundreds of resources, it is possible that we won't always be able to fetch all the resources due to like crawl rate or HTTP errors or stuff like that. So JavaScript's great, but I'd also take some care to make sure that the web page isn't too fragile if errors do happen.
Okay, so how do you mean fragile if errors happen?
Like if you have a web page which accesses an API endpoint, and that API endpoint could return a 429 under certain circumstances, then this is one example of where things could go wrong. If the return call there is critical and the page fails to have good contents without a successful response from it.
Okay, and then what happens? Does the page just stop loading, or does everything get deleted?
It depends on the web page. I've seen like partial page contents, blank pages, pages which redirect to google.com, error messages. If there's going to be like an error and you can't load the contents, I think it's best to have a clear error message, but ideally it's best to have the contents, of course.
Okay, and so I guess on the one hand, the error handler is something that should be kind of reasonable and not crash the rest of the page's loading, but...
Yeah. Like if there's an uncaught exception because a video fails to load. I've seen a case where a video fails to load, so the page redirects to google.com, actually.
Wow.
That's a popular redirect destination. And this was a case where the page had good contents, but then this tiny little thing went wrong. So it's like, I'm going to throw this all away. So if there is an error, I just try and handle it as gracefully as possible. And this is hard stuff. Don't get me wrong. Web development is hard stuff. I'm not a web developer. It terrifies me.
I guess testing it is hard if it sometimes breaks, but if it always breaks, what would you recommend? Like how could someone test it to see if it's generally possible that it could work?
There's this webmaster tool, Search Console, URL inspection tool. That's great stuff.
If that works, then generally it's possible that Googlebot could also render it.
Yes, generally.
And rendering in Google is as close to a normal browser as possible, right? But it's not quite the same, is it?
Yeah. Do you want to hear another ghost story, Martin?
Oh, please do tell.
It's not quite the same. And one of the ways it's different is we try and do things as efficiently as possible. So efficiently that there's this certain JavaScript event that we were not firing called request idle callback because our browser was never idle.
Oh.
This is all well and good, but there was a certain popular video website, which I won't name to protect the guilty, which deferred loading any of the page contents until after request idle callback was fired. This is actually a very reasonable thing to do. You might want to, get the video playing first and then load all the comments and stuff, for example. But since our browser was never actually idle, this event was never fired, so we couldn't load most of the page contents, which was a problem for this website.
Oh.
So now we fake being idle every once in a while just so pages get that event. That's one of the weird things that can happen when you have a browser that's mostly but not entirely like a normal browser.
So it has to be I'm so bored, and actually it's busy all the time. What kind of things have you noticed that people otherwise get wrong when it comes to rendering?
Another common class of issues is called user agent shenanigans. Shenanigans being a technical industry term, that's what we call it in the biz.
What are user agent shenanigans? Enlighten us.
So imagine you write a website and you're like, I really, really want Google in particular to be able to index this web page. So you're like, okay, I'll put in if statement. If user agent header equals Googlebot, go down this code path and output this HTML, which I think will be really good for Googlebot for some reason. And this is all well and good. It's tested, it works. But then years pass by. The website changes. Maybe it gets updated to a different framework or whatnot. And there's just this code still lurking deep within it somewhere. And it starts outputting HTML, which is broken or useless or missing contents or stuff like that. And this is what I would call user agent shenanigans.
We used to call that dynamic rendering, and we're actually discouraging it now, if that makes you a little happier.
So there is an industry term for it besides shenanigans.
I think I ran across a case of this recently. Now that you mention it like this. So in one of the help forum threads, someone was mentioning that their homepage title was wrong. And I looked into it, and it seemed that we were being redirected to a page that does a 404. But if you look at it in a browser, it redirects to a page that's normal. And in the end, I noticed you could reproduce it by telling Chrome to use Googlebot's user agent.
Oh, yeah. I love that feature.
Probably that is happening in the background where someone is like, oh, I will be smart and do something special for Googlebot. And then the next person who works on the website is like, I don't know. I don't see anything wrong. It works for me.
Yeah, I love the DevTools user agent override feature. It's great for debugging stuff like this. Sometimes I'll even be trying to debug a web page and I change my user agent to Googlebot, and then it's like, your access to this web page has been denied because you're using a suspicious user agent. And I'm like, no, I wanted to debug this.
Shenanigans gone wrong.
That's where they're being good and checking that the Googlebot user agent comes from an official IP address as recommended in the documentation. But it still makes it harder for me to debug, so I cry a single tear.
Okay, that's understandable, I would say.
How do you feel about JavaScript redirects? So redirect is kind of a topic in the SEO world where everyone has very strong opinions, and JavaScript redirects kind of feels like that thing is like, it's like even normal server-side redirects are this weird SEO myth topic, and JavaScript redirects are like, oh my gosh, what do we even do with them?
What do we even do with them? Well, we follow them.
So they work just like normal redirects, or?
For the most part. JavaScript redirects, of course, have to happen at render time instead of crawl time, but that's pretty much the only thing special about them. I don't think we treat them differently in any way. There have been cases where a web page gets into a JavaScript redirect loop, which is not very fun, but
okay. Yeah, well, I guess that happens with normal server-side redirects from time to time as well, where they're like, oh, you don't have a cookie. It's like, here's a cookie. And then it checks again. And it's like, oh, you didn't take my cookie. Take another one. And just keeps going forever.
Our cookies do work pretty good, though.
We have good cookies.
We have fairly good cookies, yeah.
And in rendering, do we also accept cookies? Or how does that work?
Do we accept cookies? Cookies are enabled. If there's a cookie dialog that says, do you want to accept or deny these cookies? We won't click either button. We're rogue like that. We just don't make a decision. But on the browser level, cookies are enabled. So if a web page, sets a cookie without going through a dialog, then we'll see it.
Okay, but we don't keep that for the next time, right?
No. Rendering is stateless. Every time it happens, it's a completely fresh browser session, basically.
It's very, very nice. So if we're in the territory of we're not clicking on cookie banners and it's stateless, I think when we fetch things, we're using Googlebot for that, right? So we do follow robots.txt?
Yeah, of course we follow robots.txt. That's the whole point of robots.txt.
But browsers don't.
Yes, but we're a search engine, Martin.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, fine. But that means that if your API is roboted or disallowed for Googlebot, then rendering can't fetch API content, right?
That's correct. So we'll get the crawl, which is like the HTML. And that could be roboted, but if it's not roboted and it's HTML, it's sent to rendering. And then rendering loads this in a browser, which of course can make HTTP fetches to a bunch of other stuff. And any of those other resources could also be roboted. If a resource is roboted, we just can't fetch it. We continue on with rendering the rest. So if there's an API call, you said, and we can't fetch the API call, then maybe that's okay if it wasn't doing anything important. But if it was fetching the page contents, then we have a problem.
And I guess that's hard for us on Google's side to recognize because we don't know what the page is supposed to look like.
Yeah, I mean, it is very reasonable for someone to just be like, I don't want Google saying my contents. I'm just going to block this API call. Fair enough. I'm totally okay with that. But if it looks like a broken page, it's can't be indexed the best way.
Cool. Well, this was super fun. Thanks for joining us, Zoe.
Oh, yeah. It's always a lovely time to hang out with my good pals, John and Martin.
Aw.
Thank you, Zoe. It's always good to talk to you. And rendering is such a fascinating topic. And the WRS, the web rendering service, such an amazing piece of software.
Yeah, the last time I had a talk with Martin, we were up on stage at Google I/O, and that is a blank spot in my memory. I remember nothing of it. I just remember getting up on stage and walking off of stage, and that's it.
Having a great time. Hopefully this was a great time as well, and maybe you'll remember this one as well.
Oh, I hope so.
We'll send you a recording to remember.
No, John, this has been search of the record. There's no record.
Oh, off the record, of course. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for being here. Thank you, John, for joining me as well. And everyone out there, thank you so much for being with us. And I hope that this episode was interesting and fun and useful.
May your page indexes be contentful.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.
We've been having fun with these podcast episodes, and we hope that you, the listener, have found them both entertaining and insightful too. Feel free to drop us a note on Twitter at Google Search C, or chat with us at one of the next upcoming events that we go to. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.